Hi, I'm Mark Reed. Follow me as I attempt to put my new book, Impact Culture, into practice and discuss it with others taking a similar journey. You'll get tips that will help you achieve more impact from your research and stay healthy, no matter how busy you are. Rediscover your purpose. Lead from behind to empower those around you. Transform your work culture. Welcome to Season 4 of the Fast Track Impact Podcast. Okay, welcome to the podcast, Petra Boynton. It is a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Petra, I've been a big fan of what you've done for many years now. I got to know about you through your work on Twitter. Your last book, in fact, I think it's The Research Companion. I forget that I appreciated and enjoyed, and a load of support that you gave to readers of that book, which was great. But in particular, your most recent book is what I want to focus on today, Being Well in Academia, Ways to Feel Stronger, Safer and More Connected, published by Routledge. Now, for those of you who don't know Petra is a social psychologist by training. She's an academic, a trainer, a consultant. She does really broad-ranging stuff, all the way from academic skills, research integrity, these kind of things, right the way through to health and safety. But I particularly like what you do, Petra, in the mental health space. And I think also just the bravery that you have in challenging some of the systems that perpetuate the challenges that we see, these systemic issues that are leading to burnout, that are preventing people from getting help, where people are kind of jumping on the bandwagon and saying they're doing things, but a word that you've used here is performative. So it's good to look like we're doing something good in this space, but actually, are we really doing something good? So I wonder if you can start just by unpacking what you see as some of the key systemic challenges for us being well in academia, Petra.
Thank you. I mean, it's tricky to do in a short period of time because I could talk about it all day, but I promise I won't. I think most people listening will recognise the systemic problems to a greater or lesser degree, and they are things like the thing that makes academia run, really. So it's often the stuff that's sold to you when you come into academia, certainly when you're an undergraduate or doing a PhD or an early career researcher, as being things of value, things of they're positives, they're sold as, but of course we know in a lot of ways they're not. And they would be things like sort of competitiveness, of overwork culture, of the idea of constantly striving for the next thing. So it's not just getting a grant, it must be a grant from a particular place and it must be to a particular value. It's not just publishing, you've got to publish in a particular journal and then you've got to be cited and you've got to be cited a certain number of times. So there's sort of a metrification that goes on around our work, the way that we are encouraged to not work collaboratively, although we talk about that. There is not really the sort of collegial space that I think we are enticed by, or certainly I was. There's a lot of sort of looking at other people, am I as good as them, being held up to other people and told you're not as good as them, the precarity aspect of work, the uncertainty of it, and I think that it was a problem a long time before the pandemic, but the pandemic has not helped. And I think that the sort of global financial concerns that are now coming up towards us too have all left people feeling very uncertain and very anxious. Where do I fit? What can I do? And there has been collective organising, but not enough. And quite a lot of that collective organising, I think, has rightfully been about explaining problems and exposing harms and abuses. But of course, the difficulty with that is that that's a very challenging and difficult environment to be constantly wading through. It's people described it to me as sort of like wading through mud or through treacle, is that you're kind of trying to get yourself out of something that's sucking you down endlessly. So that was a kind of very long way of sort of identifying some of the problems, and I'm sure people listening will be able to talk about many more. Bullying is something that we deal with a lot as a consequence of this sort of toxic environment. And so my challenge has been for a very long time the fact that the university, the academic system, is in many ways the cause of our problems, but is also supposed to offer us the solutions. And I don't think something that's harming you is actually the right or appropriate place to make you better. So in a lot of cases, I'm interested in what's the systemic problem that's making us unhappy or unwell, and how do we challenge that rather than a sort of more surface level approach that I think is currently quite popular.
Yeah, so I agree with that diagnosis, and I think a lot of people listening will resonate. The hustle, as it's sometimes described as, that then combined with this metrification, which encourages constant comparison to others, and the precarity of tenure, adding up to a toxic culture that ultimately expresses itself through things like bullying. And when it comes to solving this, where I'd like to start is where you've begun, which is thinking about how we can change the system. I'd like to also come to some of the bottom-up kind of strategies, what we can do to survive, maybe even thrive within what is still a toxic culture, whilst trying to fight for these more systemic changes. But you started by saying, well, maybe the first step before we can even begin to contemplate systemic change is to actually expose the problem and understand that problem and the depth of that problem. But more than just those case studies of the terrible things that happen, to actually understand the breadth, the tentacles that these problems have used to kind of infect across the system. So tell me a bit more about what you've been doing, what we should be doing collectively to expose these problems and the depth and breadth of those problems. And then tell me a bit more about some of the things that you think that institutions could do that would go beneath the surface.
I mean, our biggest challenge, I suspect, is that we can talk about all these things, but it really requires the institution to recognise and respect it and want to change. And something has changed in the last 20 years. So I've been working on this for about 20 years now, not perhaps in the same way as I'm doing it currently, but certainly by looking at the sort of systemic problems and safety was where I began with this. And then it moved on to looking at bullying, because every time I tried to teach about safety, someone would come up and say, well, it's all well and good teaching me about fieldwork safety, but actually I'm happier being in fieldwork because it's in my department that I'm being bullied. So it's sort of, it's spread since then, but I think what we're getting a lot of at the moment is that we'll have mental health days, or we'll have it, there's a World Mental Health Day coming up soon. Universities across the UK and worldwide are going to be branded. You wait and watch. All the social media will be about mental health, and there'll be special statements made and a link to some kind of helpline, or something will be done. And they might even have things like, a cup of tea and a time to chat, and things that are absolutely lovely, but are utterly hopeless if the underlying culture and problems are not changed. And I think a lot of staff feel they have not been treated well or respected or acknowledged what they've gone through and done above and beyond the call of duty. And that's not just for universities. I think politicians haven't given that respect either. But students also, I think, talk about feeling that they have not been given what they were expecting. And some of that's pandemic related, but some of it isn't. So I think that we need at a kind of, it's even big above institutional level. So at the highest level of government, at the highest level of funding bodies and research organisations and university, organisations, charities, and any big groups, of which there are now a lot. We need collective working there. So it's not all this sort of silo practice and almost competition going on about who's doing different schemes and event, activities. It needs to be joined up, and it needs to focus on a very diverse range of needs that people have. So that would be, for me, the sort of starting point is it needs to be acknowledged and recognised far higher up than it is now. And I'm not hopeful at this point that will happen. It's got better, but you have to fight for it. I mean, I find it utterly ridiculous that I spend a large proportion of my time literally begging, research councils, universities, funders, all sorts of different people, just to look at joined up systems of tuition, funding, supervision, and pastoral care. These are all things that should be happening. I'm not asking for anything new or different, and I'll be honest, I fail most of the time. I have not got a good success rate. I spend a lot of time yelling about it. And you mentioned Twitter. I do a lot of time yelling on Twitter because that's the only place you can get people to notice. So trying to get meetings, trying to email people, trying to send them copies of resources and books, offering to go and do training, offering to go and just be a good critical friend, trying to set up meetings, is met largely with being ignored or, thanks very much, and then again being ignored. So I think all of that culture needs to shift. And I think, and maybe this is something you'd like to pause and sort of explore in a bit more depth, I think we need to have a discussion about why are we interested in academic mental health? Why now? What's happened to make that happen? And some of the more basic questions that as researchers we should always be asking about, well, what do we mean by academic mental health? And who are we talking about when we're talking about that? And how are we proposing to actually put things in place? So people quite often will say stuff like, every university department must have a resident counsellor, or it should be mandatory for anyone doing a PhD to have therapy as course of the PhD, or if you're an early career researcher, part of your career development should be mandatory counselling. And I think that there are pragmatic questions to ask about, is that needed? Is it appropriate? Are there any counsellors to do that job, actually? That's a big problem. But also, what else can and should we be doing that's actually making people feel so unwell? Would that be something that you'd like to sort of go into in a bit more depth?
Yeah, exactly. So why are we asking this now? Well, I think we are kind of somewhere between the expose and the recognise stage. So you suggested 3 phases. First, we expose. Second, people start to recognise there's a problem. And thirdly, we start to change. And I think that that exposure is growing in terms of momentum. The recognition now is there across the board, but a lot of that remains lip service because we haven't seen the actual real change that we want to see. And from the top down, I agree with you that we ideally need collective working across governments, funders, universities to think about this in terms of the whole system. But I think that for your average academic or PhD student or researcher, ultimately this is going to be their institution that is going to really be able to move the needle on this. And so what can we do to go beneath those nicely branded words on social media next time there's an event or a global day on this? And I think my own experience of this is that all of the institutions I have worked with and do still work with, and I've many different roles, they all pay lip service to this. And when you talk to the managers, they care about this stuff and devastated often to hear of the things that are happening under their watch and want to change them. But nobody seems to know what to actually do about this. So I think I want to come on to the bottom up in a moment, because I think there are things we can all do, and we should all be part of this problem. It's not just a kind of an othering conversation, well, it's up to them, the senior managers. But I think that there are things that senior managers can do. So I've talked on the podcast about changing from mentoring to coaching, creating safe spaces where academics can talk about the whole of their lives, not just their academic life, and integrate that and think about how to get work-life balance, prevent burnout, and things like that. We have mental health first aiders at Scotland's Rural College, where I work at the moment. I've never heard of the idea of mandatory counselling. I have no idea what I think of that. Some part of me thinks that's amazing. Another part of me thinks that's horrific. I'm really not sure. But yeah, I think that most people's experience is, well, yeah, I've got a line manager and they have a pastoral responsibility. And the reality is I see them once a year, and it's integrated with some kind of professional review process that actually intimidates the hell out of me. And, and yeah, the reality is I feel that there is no real support or help there, and I suffer in silence. So yeah, expand on some of these options. If you are a senior manager, head of school, head of a research group, a PI on a project, what are the things you can do to put in place that might prevent things going wrong, ideally, or help people for whom things are getting really difficult?
When we look at the history, say the recent history of academia, a way I think a lot of the discourse runs is it's either that it was great in the past and it's terrible now, or that actually it was terrible in the past and now, because of regulation and metrics and all sorts of assessments and things, that now it's under control and better. And in truth, it's neither of those things. In the past, we did used to have systems in place that are no longer there, and I think people forget that. And it may be because they've not been in academia long enough to know that at all, or they're so stressed with just trying to keep up that those memories are gone, or there's no point in thinking back to the past because we're not there anymore. But it's really important to note that we did used to have systems, even if they were not always perfect, of supervision, tuition, funding, and there were things like, when we talk about counselling, so I would say, in terms of mandatory counselling, I don't think mandatory counselling is good for anybody. If you're being pushed to do something you probably don't need, it's not going to help you. But something like debriefing may well be useful, or a space to vent, or perhaps, a common room where you can all share a coffee, or a space that there is a counsellor available should you need it. People, I think, are not aware that those places have been cut, not just because of the pandemic, but beforehand. So lots of services were cut outside of academia. So our mental health services in the UK have been absolutely decimated, and particularly CAMS for young people. So a lot of young students coming in have probably been on the waiting list to get mental health care and are still waiting when they get to university. Now, a university counsellor is not necessarily the same as psychiatric support that they should have had years ago, or maybe an assessment to identify if they have learning difficulties or their neurodivergence. So there's lots of things that have broken outside academia that we're expecting academia to fix, but at the same time we also broke them in academia and we didn't bother to replace them. And so my interest is looking at things like, when I talk to staff and students, and when I say staff, I don't just mean people who are doing academic jobs. I mean people who are doing all sorts of jobs in universities. So it could be people working in catering, or people working in cleaning, or people who are admin, or who are lecturing as a sessional lecturer, or a fully tenured professor. It's very interesting that supervision is often not there. So that could be equipment, it could be instructions, it could be time for somebody to spend knowing, do you know what to do in your job? And so a lot of times when they're talking about being very unhappy and distressed, it's coming from not knowing what they're supposed to do, or not being paid adequately to do it, or inadequate housing, or inadequate working conditions, or the fact that you're expected still in this day and age where actually we do know really well how to support people doing lots of different research jobs, that you are still expected to muddle through somehow. And some people still have this sort of attitude that learning by error or learning by doing is great. And, I think being allowed to make mistakes is great, but the expectation that you learn by making preventable mistakes that cause a great deal of upset to you and waste time is not good practice. So, as you said with the pastoral care example, yes, there's someone you can talk to, but you're only going to see them once a year, and they couldn't be less interested when you talk to them if you go there. There isn't, supervisors are expected to supervise PhDs, for example, or big projects with minimal training and minimal assistance and huge pressure, and you're not being evaluated on did you care and nurture your team and support participants in the community and ensure that you did really rigorous, ethical, careful and inclusive work. All of those things to me would be valuable things to measure, and metrics, if we were going to have metrics. You're measured on, do you get a publication at the end? And have you satisfied your funders? And can you put on the website that you've got a fantastic grant? So I think that there are lots of things that have dropped and have gone by the wayside around tuition, around supervision, around joined up campus care. So if there is stuff, it may be that there is support there, but nobody knows. As you said, you often talk to managers and they're upset about this. I very often talk to different departments where they've got really innovative and fantastic projects. And I am glad to see places like the Office for Students now are showcasing that work more, where they funded work. But we aren't documenting and evaluating and learning from that or sharing it. And even in the same department, people may not know that something really fantastic and innovative was being tried. Or something as basic as just, a cup of tea and a time to chat once a week. That's simplistic, and I dislike it when it's sort of rolled out as a solution. But actually, these sort of informal things that people can build their own care systems within always work really well. And it's the taking away of those spaces. I think the other thing that's really important that we ignore is things like study skills, things like library services, disability offices, accessibility. A lot of people are made very unhappy and unwell because the accommodations that they're legally entitled to are not provided. And if they are provided, they're done with such bad grace and such, poor delivery. So a lot of the time it's why I want to come back always to what do we mean by mental health, because I think most people's idea of mental health and the way most universities present it is mild to moderate anxiety or depression that has got nothing whatsoever to do with the institution. You're just feeling a bit glum or a bit worried, and a kind of vaguely defined mental health care or counselling is going to sort that. And it absolves the university, I think, of any responsibility. But it also ignores the fact that bullying and racism and ableism and all the other prejudices that universities not only let thrive, but often encourage or blame victims for, along with this sort of pressure cooker environment that we're in, and the lack of supervision and support because we are not investing in that. We are doing more and more and more research. It's like endless research. We could almost do with doing a bit less research, really. But we're doing so much work and running around on these hamster wheels, and yet nobody is being trained up. And yet also everyone expects and assumes that that's in place. So people assume that you've been trained to supervise. People assume that during your PhD you learnt essential research skills. People assume that time management and leadership and all these other things, how to manage your emails, how to manage your rest, how to work online or work from home, or all the other things that we do, is assume that either innately you have them or that somebody somewhere, but not us, have provided that support. And for me, I think a large amount of this mental health crisis that we're discussing would disappear overnight if funding, supervision, training, pastoral care, those sort of 4 things were, and work-life balance, if those things were put into place alongside sort of tackling the inequalities and harms that go on, would probably then leave a space for people who are still struggling, and maybe also give us a bit more of a broader space, because I think when we talk about mental health, it's not about severe mental illness, for example. And so a lot of people talk about the fact that they are left out from discussions because their mental health difficulties or the causes of the mental health problems or possible solutions are not fit for purpose.
I agree. And I think there's a very clear call here to invest. And the kinds of people with the kinds of jobs and responsibilities that you're talking to here often, I think, have to justify these things with their business case. I do not think you should have to justify this kind of stuff with a business case, but if that's how it works at those levels, then surely if you look at the cost to the institution of the number of days off work due to burnout, the lack of productivity because people are just going around in circles, being unproductive because of just the low grades, exhaustion that builds up over time as you don't tackle these things and one thing compounds another. It surely has to make sense on multiple levels, but there is just this element of our common humanity, and there has to be this moral appeal that we cannot continue doing this. We cannot continue to allow both the rates of mental and physical health issues in the economy to continue going the wrong way. I want to finish by thinking a little bit about some of the stuff that we can do from the bottom up. Many of people listening to this, I don't have the power to change these things. I recognize this. I resonate with this. And perhaps if that's you, then one of the things that I hope is happening now is that you're giving yourself a bit of self-compassion here as you recognize, this is a system-wide thing. This isn't just me, my group, my department, my faculty, my university. There are others who experience this. And perhaps I can reach out to others in my own networks and start to talk about these in the expectation that others will resonate, others will talk, and perhaps we can become more resilient as a result. I will confess that I have a bit of a Trojan a Trojan horse model for tackling these kinds of things, where I effectively do quite a bit of stuff on research integrity. But my experience is, especially for senior colleagues, you don't think that you need research integrity training. I mean, of course, your research has integrity. I do rigorous, robust work. But it's surprising. How long ago was that training? Did you actually have any training in this stuff? And even if you did, actually, have things changed? And so my next paper coming out in Sustainability Science includes a positionality statement, including an apology for the epistemic racism in some of my own PhD research. And we didn't get training in those kinds of issues at that time, but I now understand, and I'm trying to make amends for that. So these things change. We need this. But my senior colleagues will come along to an impact culture training. And if this is about a research impact culture, then research integrity has to be one of the core foundations of a healthy impact culture, I would argue. And the same when it comes to work-life balance and mental health. The people who need that most will not typically come along to this. Well, I'm too busy. That's the whole problem. I don't have work-life balance. I can't make time for a training on this. But my experience is that they will come along to something called the productive researcher because, I need to become more more productive so that I can get more stuff done. And maybe that's how I'll get my work-life balance. And yes, there are some things you can do in that productivity space that can help you do more stuff in less time and enable you to get work-life balance. But ultimately, this is a course about changing how you think and reframing your relationship with work so that you produce the deep stuff that really matters and don't just get caught up in this. One final thing just to say before I get some of your thoughts. Just recently we had a research group meeting, and there are two white male professors in the group, me being one of them, and I was talking to the other guy, and we've both been having mental health problems, and it's been impacting on our work, and we are both aware that there are issues that our colleagues are, if not facing now, going to face because of our own mental health challenges. And it took a bit of courage, but we both said, you know what, if you'll speak about it, I'll speak about it. And we both went along to this research group meeting and just said, look, we're struggling at the moment, and these are the reasons. And the response, the compassion, the generosity of the group was incredible. And one of the things that's come out of that is, hey, let's have a weekly social lunch just as a group. Let's meet up, and we'll do it online so it's inclusive for everyone. And at the same time, what can we take? Because other people then started saying, well, actually, I've been having similar problems as well. And actually, there are things that we might want to take to senior managers. And what are the processes and how do we do that? And how do we make sure that we all support each other? And I thought what was great about this was that this is a meeting where typically you do the rounds and everyone gives an update and we all tell each other of our successes. Oh, I published this paper and I've just submitted this grant and I'm working on this new thing. Do you want to get involved? And we create this impression that everyone's life is perfect. We're all just producing stuff constantly. And I think I have been particularly guilty of that in this group. And so for me, this is about saying, you know what, we are all human beings and we all struggle and we need each other, and trying to lead by example and saying, you know what, let's just talk about this stuff. And that's your first point. Let's expose the problem, and maybe we can find a way to support each other. So what are your thoughts for people listening to this? I don't have the power to change the system, but I want to be part of the solution. What can we do?
Well, I think there's several things we can do. And one of them, I think you just explained really well, is about in places you feel safe and comfortable, being open and honest about what's going on. Now, that might be within a research team or within your department or with a discussion with a supervisor. It might be that you talk to a therapist or a helpline or your GP or friends and family. I talk a lot about sort of setting up a support network, and that can be whatever you choose it to be, but that you can't do this alone. And I think that one of the things about both academia in its modern sense and also the way that we sort of talk about mental health is it's very, well, at least in the sort of global north, is it's an individualistic model. So it's the idea that you strive to get better, you have things to fix, you have things to achieve and do. But actually you won't, it's no good for you doing this on your own. It really isn't. So my first sort of tip is to recognise you aren't alone and to recognise that you are in a system that is currently broken and it's not your fault. It doesn't mean that it's all bad or all terrible, because we wouldn't be here if we didn't want to do it. A lot of us are here because we deeply love what we do for all sorts of reasons, and maybe it's just we need to pay the bills. I mean, it could be all sorts of things, but it is broken. Lots of places are broken at the moment, and I think living in an uncertain times is always challenging. But again, that's why I think having a collectivist approach, so that's your friends, your family, your colleagues, professional organisations, support groups you found, that could be sort of self-help support groups or mental health support groups, or it might be academic groups, but also joining a union if one is open to you. There are lots and lots of different ways of knowing that you are not alone. And I think everybody I know who's ever sought help, whether that's to address bullying or to address well-being or to get research skills or for whatever reason they've gone about it, always feel worse just beforehand because it's anxious and they don't know what to expect and they're fearful it might, get worse before it gets better. But they're usually very relieved to have said something. And I think also the point you made about sharing, it's, storytelling is very powerful. We've always known that. And there are a number of projects, I think, at the moment across academia where people are sharing their mental health stories, and we can probably link to some of those for people to find. But I think being able to say there have been points in our lives that we've been mentally unwell, because that's very common and we all struggle with it. And to maybe do that when you feel safe and comfortable is good. And as you found, when you share it, people are like, oh my gosh, it's not just me. And then it's like, well, where should we go next? I think there are some other things that we can do. I mean, one of them, I think, is we do need to be mindful of the fact that services outside academia, as I mentioned, are all being cut. And even though there's sort of lots of promises about transforming mental health and grand schemes at the moment, because it's linked to the NHS and the NHS is being decimated, we have a real problem with accessing care. People can pay for private therapy, but that's not necessarily what everybody wants or needs or can afford. So I think we have to look at the sort of approach that we are in a bumpy time. There are things we need. We can and should ask universities for them and hold them accountable. And I think the point you made about the sort of Trojan horse model in some ways works better. So they are less likely to do, they'll do like a mindfulness webinar that nobody wants or has the time to use. But actually they won't invest in like a whole department sort of strategizing to address mental well-being and embed that through everything they do. That's what they should be doing, but they're not probably going to do that. Much as I shout about it, they probably aren't. But I think if we all started saying, look, actually, I can't supervise this PhD without adequate supervision and support and time and remuneration. I can't teach without a secure contract. I can't actually go about doing my research without proper research training in that area. And within that, ensure that we embed safety and well-being and rights and dignity and inclusion and accessibility in all we do. That may be another way of going at it. I know that there are some plans. Again, the Office for Students is going to look at the sort of link of providing NHS care and mental health care for students. I'm one of the few people actually who's ever researched both things at a high level, and I did offer again to be a critical friend and helper to them, and I've heard nothing back as usual, but I will continue to keep saying, I think it's important that we keep not just sharing our stories of mental health, but those of us who are in a position to do so, document and expose. I think it's been very valuable for me, both personally and I think for other people, to see that this is not a new area. This hasn't just suddenly sprung up. I'm not new to this, but people were doing this a long time before me. And again, if you look at sort of outside the American STEM focus, which is really where a lot of the anxieties in this area and most of the research is sort of concentrated currently, people in the global south have been doing really interesting work for this for a long, long time, and they're still doing really innovative work now, and we're not making as much use of that as we should. And I think also there's been loads of really deep philosophical, critical work on the academy and universities going back a long way that we could be drawing on still and should be noting, that tells us that people have tried to bring change and it's resisted. And I think that's important to note as well. So it's setting up your support network, documenting what's going on, providing solutions that you think would work for other people, looking to see what other people are doing and sharing that. And it might be we have to just do that for ourselves right now. And it may be that you agree with your colleagues that, okay, your university is not going to set up a training day on safety or integrity or productivity, but there might be some online videos or this podcast or other things as a jumping off point that they can discuss with. There's something about burnout and stress that makes us exhausted and we want someone to come along and fix things. And at our most ground down, it's really hard to say to people, you need to have hope and you need to have courage and you need to be persistent especially if you're sick or disabled or otherwise excluded. If you're a parent or a carer or you've been bereaved, there's lots going on in our lives that makes this really hard. But pragmatically, I think that's how we have to proceed for now. So we do need to push for things, but when they don't deliver it, I think we have to hold them accountable. So when they do have their mental health day or whatever, back patting activity, you need to be there with the evidence to say, actually, we offered this or we asked for this. It's no good saying that PhD students are suffering when you have not put in place adequate supervision and support and training for that to happen, or adequate fees or payments. So I think it's that at a time when we're very, very tired that we need to do that work. But also drawing on, anything that makes you feel that you can cope, really, that's not also harming you is crucial.
I think this message of hope is so important when you don't feel like you've got the energy to keep persisting, to keep trying to do what you need to do. And I think some really great advice there for us as individuals. But retaining at the same time, I love it, and you always do this, is that, I'm here to help you as an individual, but I'm not taking my eye off that systemic cause. And so you've offered help to Government Office for Students and to many others in this area. We've got a couple of minutes left. I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about what you can offer to help people in management roles, but also what you can do for individual students, PhD students, researchers, academics like myself. Tell us a little bit more about what people can do if they want to work with you, how you can help.
Well, I think the first thing that would be really helpful is getting Being Well in Academia into libraries. I think people are often put off. It's, again, the downside of the Trojan horse is if you're very honest about something, people are like, actually, we'd have probably preferred the stealth title. But I would say getting Being Well in Academia into libraries, because it signposts to help. It explains very simply ways you can help yourself. It's not going to change your life. I don't claim that that's going to happen. It's written in the sort of tradition of advice giving, which is it's only going to take you a little bit further than you were, but hopefully that's far enough that you can then get to the next bit of support that then propels you even further. So that will be, if you want to buy it, lovely, but get it in your libraries, get it as electronic copies so that everyone can access it, would be a great way to start, because it's designed that you can use it for teaching and pastoral care, but you can also use it in your own support and well-being. And it's designed to be global, so that there are lots of resources in there. They're not just UK focused, they're focused all over, as much as I could find different sources of support. My offer to research councils, to Universities UK, to Office for Students, to all of those bodies remains that I am very happy to discuss how we can look at the causes and solutions that are driving a lot of mental distress, so that we can then leave the mental health professionals to do their job. I am not a mental health professional. I am somebody who's got a passion for research and making it safer and more inclusive and more ethical. And because of that, I'm very keen to make sure we do it really well and we don't make people unhappy or unwell through the way that we operate academic systems. So my offer will continue to be there, and let us see if anything happens. But it remains to be there. And then I think with universities, the work I do with universities is either working with doctoral programs or with HR departments or with university departments to do training at different levels. So it might be for postgrads, it might be for ECRs. Most of my work's in that area, but I do also quite a lot for senior academics around sort of pastoral care and supervision and safety. And I'm really interested in sort of making research better. So the practical how-to stuff, which doesn't sound fun, but I promise I make it fun. Somebody once had I ever understudied for Julie Walters in my feedback for my training, and that's the best compliment I've ever had. So I promise it won't be boring. But I think even if it's just a sort of a session on critical friendship of sitting down, so with a lot of departments, that's what we've done, is I've just sat with them and got them to tell me what do they do already and what do they know about. And we create campus care maps and we map what's available and we look at how to embed systems, and we look at how to make everything just a bit better across campus, and we go with their strengths. It's not I think there's a lot of shame in this at the moment, that we're all exhausted and we're all really battered by this whole system, and then we're made to feel like we're doing a bad job. And although I think, I do get frustrated, especially on social media, and shout, and maybe sometimes I shouldn't as much, the work I like to do is very gentle. It's very collectivist. It's us working together at different levels, at different times in our research careers, to just make it easier, and to help the communities we are here to research and support and serve. So I think that will be the sort of general areas that I'm working. But I would say, if anybody's interested, just to say, can I help? Because if I can't, I know somebody who can.
Yeah, you do in fact describe yourself as an agony aunt on Twitter. So
yeah,
very, very, very accessible, and yeah, thank you. There's a humility, a gentleness, a compassion that comes across, not only in what you've said, but in how you said that today. And just to back up, I've read this, and it is just packed full. Sorry, I'm holding up to the camera, and you can't see this. I read Being Well in Academia, and it is just packed full of practical advice. And just, there's a plan A and there's a plan B. The detail with which you have gone into every conceivable challenge, and also a very helpful index at the back. Whether you read it from cover to cover or you just have it here to dip into the bits that are relevant to you, it's definitely worth getting. And I've put a link in the show notes to both this and your last book, The Research Companion, Petra. So it just remains for me to say thank you. It's been a wide-ranging, but for me, a really heartwarming and helpful conversation, and I hope for you, if you've been listening to this, that you're having the same reaction as I am. So thank you, Petra. I really appreciate it.